Leopold wanted some part of the world where he could reign supreme and where he could make a lot of money. And he got in right at the beginning of what's often talked about as the European scramble for Africa, where the major countries in Europe competed with each other to grab portions of the African continent. And it's amazing how much they grabbed in such a short time. In 1870, 80% of the African continent was under the rule of indigenous kings, chiefs, leaders of one sort or another. By 35 years later, virtually all of it was either white settler colonies like South Africa, run by their white settlers, or it was European colonies or so-called protectorates of one sort or another.
Not the country of Belgium or the kingdom of Belgium, but for him as a king, personally, it was his personal.
It was his personal possession, and he talked about himself as its proprietor. And it was more than 70 times the size of Belgium. It remained in his personal possession for 23 years. And then in 1908, a year before he died, it became the Belgian Congo. But up to that point, it belonged to him personally, and he made an enormous fortune from it during that time, chiefly by developing a forced labor system to gather what was then the territory's most lucrative commodity, which was wild rubber. And basically, his soldiers would go into village after village, would hold the women hostage in order to force the men of each village to go deep into the rainforest for days and eventually weeks out of each month and gather a monthly quota of wild rubber. And you can actually see photographs of these women hostages in chains.
What was happening in the world at the time? What was driving the need for this rubber?
Good question. It really began in 1887 when, for the first time, they invented the inflatable bicycle tire. And then suddenly there was a big demand for rubber for bicycle tires, and very soon after that for automobiles, which really began in the 1890s. There was also a big market for rubber in industrial uses of all kinds, belts, rubber belts in factories, rubber coatings on the telegraph and telephone wires, which were spreading all over the world. So there was a huge market for rubber. But in order to plant a plantation of rubber trees, have them grow to maturity where you can begin harvesting rubber from them, that takes about 15 years. So the people who could really make a killing were people like Leopold, who had sections of the African rainforest where rubber grew wild, not as trees, but as vines, which twined around palm trees or other trees up to where they could get some sunlight.
Were there other countries interested in that region? Did they ever have to fight with him for potentially with this, vast wealth that he was controlling?
Well, when Leopold got his hands on the territory and got, as I mentioned, the US and all the other major countries to recognize it as his own, it was before they had discovered that rubber was really the valuable commodity there. That came a few years later. At the time, they were thinking mainly about ivory. Other countries also seized the colonies in the region: Britain, France, Germany, Portugal. And those that had wild rubber, which were not the British colonies, but the French and German colonies and part of the Portuguese colony of Angola, they saw how much money Leopold was making by this system of forced labor. And within 5 or 10 years, all of them adopted it also, with the similar very high death rate that existed in the country.
They instituted the same policies of torture and plunder that Leopold was using in the Congo too.
Exactly. The same business of holding the women hostage in order to turn the men into forced laborers. And you needed hostages to do that. You couldn't just chain people up and send them into the rainforest to gather rubber, because these wild rubber vines were scattered very widely. And when those near a village got tapped dry, the men might have to walk miles and miles to find other rubber vines that they could draw the rubber out.